I actually like this time of year. Halloween is kind of cool. I always liked it when I was a kid. Still do. But this time of year, I tend to do some feeding the hungry ghost ceremonies and things like that. Because, we have this ancestor recognition tradition in Buddhism that's kind of like some of the things that happen on the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day. But I suspect for most Americans, Halloween mainly means two things: candy and costumes. And I've encountered this question several times in the last week or so. What are you going to need for Halloween? I'm actually going to be a Buddhist monk. We have a meeting in DeLand on Wednesday night, so I'll be there to feed the hungry ghosts. And if I wanted to, I could put on my full robes and then go downtown afterward. Main Street DeLand has this big event called Monsters on Main Street. And if I carry a lightsaber, I look a lot like a Jedi Knight. But this question, what are you going to be, has kind of got me thinking about how we tend to kind of disguise our authentic self from others and even from ourselves. How we wear masks, you might say, to hide our true self. To discover our true self, we first have to look at the nature of what we mean when we say self. More accurately, I think we have to look at the illusion that there is a self that somehow belongs to us. And I'm going to read you a quote. A human being is a part of a whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself with thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to our affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So that quote could easily have come from the Buddha or some famous Zen master, but it's actually by Albert Einstein. And it's interesting to see that the famous physicist pointed out the role of the idea of a discrete, separate self and how it imprisons us in our suffering. And I think it's interesting to see how he believed boundless compassion was the way to free ourselves from the prison of self. So we probably don't think of our self-image very often as an optical delusion. But the question of whether or not we have a self and what is a self and all of that probably seems to have little to do with how we live our day-to-day lives most of the time. But then maybe we get a little hit to our self-esteem and we feel bad about ourselves. Or we go to a costume party and we experience some pleasure from being liberated from ourself for a few moments and be someone different. And so maybe the question of self isn't that irrelevant to day-to-day life after all. And that debate about what is self and that sort of thing was going on in India for a long time. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was asked about it several times by different people. And so there's one story about the Buddha and a conversation that he had with an ascetic called Vacchagoda the Wanderer. And he was a wandering ascetic. He was homeless. He just went around from place to place, living in the forest and so on, and exploring deep metaphysical questions. And there are a number of these conversations between him and the Buddha. And in this particular one, he asked, Venerable Gautama, is there a self? And the Buddha just sat there in silence. So Vacchagoda, after a few minutes, said, well, is there no self? And again, the Buddha just sat there in silence. So Vacchagoda got bored, got up and left. So the Buddha's cousin, Ananda, who was his constant companion, was there, and Ananda said, hey, why didn't you answer the ascetic's question? And the Buddha said, well, if I were to answer that there's a self, that would be confirming the view that there's an eternal soul, which is not something that the Buddha taught. And he said, if I were to answer that there's no self, then the bewildered Vacchagoda would have become even more bewildered and wonder, well then what about the self I used to have? Does it not now exist? So the Buddha's second major sermon, after he set forth the middle way, explained that identification with what we mistakenly think is a self is often the cause of stress. And so a lot of Buddhist practice is really aimed at letting us let go of our masks and look into the mirror that reveals our true face. If I asked you, do you know who you are? You'd probably say, well, sure. But then if you start asking yourself that question, and kind of digging for deeper and deeper answers, you find it's not that easy. One of the key Buddhist scriptures is called the Heart Sutra. It's actually part of a very large collection of writings that contains the perfection of wisdom philosophy. And this one particular short reading is considered the heart of this collection. And its core teaching is about emptiness, specifically emptiness of self. In the Buddhist view, we're a collection of processes that are all constantly in change. And our sense of self arises when we identify with a pattern within these processes. And so if we start asking the question, who am I? We can start to see that we build up this identity around patterns that really don't have any more substance than the idea of front and back have to a falling leaf. And yet we often grab onto these false identities, these identities built upon these illusions. And we can create real difficulties for ourselves when we do that. So if you start digging into this question of identity, you'll see that if you discard some of the answers that are illusory, that you'll discard the stresses that come with them. And you may also see that you have qualities that you've neglected or ignored, but that if you polish up the window that lets you see into your heart, it can be very useful. So the essence of the practice is really to awaken to our true self, which means to live an authentic life. Gyomay Kabose, one of my teachers, once wrote an essay about this, and he used the poem that I read at the beginning of the service about maple leaves. And in it, he compares our view of self to gardening. He says, it's like we keep our front yard clean and nice, but we let a big pile of mess accumulate out back where no one will see it, which is kind of what my gardening is like. But a truly authentic person doesn't have a front and back. So this old Japanese poem, I'll read it again. Showing front, showing back, maple leaves fall. The idea is that if we're living an authentic life, we lead our lives as maple leaves fall, free from secrets and pretense. And then there's no need to cling to an idea of front and back. We can let go of prejudices and preconditions that we use to obscure our experience, and then we can experience life more fully. There's a word in Buddhism, Suchness, that's kind of confusing, but it really means seeing things as they are and life as it is. It's life without any makeup. There's a Zen koan where a monk is told, show me the face that you had before your parents were born. In other words, if we apply the idea of suchness to ourselves, we see our face without our mask. The face that we experienced before we added a lot of should-bes and wanna-bes and must-bes to it, and simply accepted ourselves and our reality as they are. That doesn't mean giving in to anything or being defeated. It means recognizing life as it is. And then we can know there's no front, no back, and be honest with ourselves. There's nothing to hide from if we're sincere. We live naturally, we live authentically. This doesn't negate the importance of trying to live a good life and cultivate a good character. Buddhism encourages that. We try to cultivate skills like kindness and mindfulness and perseverance and compassion. But these are qualities that lead us to awakening, that lead us to live a more enlightened life. They're not things that we stick onto our ego to embellish it. So how do we do that? The Buddha talked about a number of processes for living more authentically. We can practice kindness and compassion. We can pause to be grateful for what we have, to be glad that we have this opportunity to live as human beings with the ability to think about things like this. And since we're not a fixed self, stuck with some preordained destiny, we can let go of processes that we've been clinging to that keep us from being able to embrace our true nature. That requires us to be able to see ourselves clearly. Very often, we mistake our mask for our true face. And we need to be able to look behind that, to see ourselves without hiding from ourselves. I have a friend who's a business consultant, and he writes a lot about integrity in business kind of settings. And he says we have 3 masks, you might say. There's the one we show others, the face that we think everyone sees when they look at us. And we could consider that our self-image. And then there's our reputation, which others see when they look at us. It's kind of like the mask they hold up in front of our face before they look at us. And then there's our true self, our character, which is what we do when we don't think anybody's looking. And integrity is what happens when all those things come somewhat into alignment. So if we start looking at our true self in the context of suchness and integrity, then we can examine our self-imposed limitations, and we can see that it's okay to be the person that we are. A rose can't be a tulip, and it doesn't need to be. It's perfectly good as a rose. And part of our job is to be what we are, to accept what we are. When we can't do that, then that's a problem. So going back to Einstein, he said something about the value of a human being. He said our value is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which we can obtain liberation from the self. And that's the purpose of the spiritual life, to take measure of yourself. In Southeast Asia, Buddhist temples are called Wat, W-A-T. And the word Wat has another meaning as well. It kind of refers to a measuring stick. So a temple is a place that you go to measure yourself against your ideal values. I once read a story about a Japanese man whose son was criticizing him a lot for going to the temple so often, making donations and things like this. The man was very religious, and his son had studied science and gotten advanced degrees at university, and he thought religion was a waste of time, and so he was kind of pestering his father to stop wasting so much time and money on something so frivolous. And so finally the father said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll stop going to the temple if you'll promise me this. For 2 weeks, you'll very diligently keep a journal of everything that you do, everything that you say, and everything that you think. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, show me the journal. If you can write about those things completely honestly and sincerely for 2 weeks and let me read the diary, I'll stop going to the temple altogether. Son said, well, this is fine. He agreed that he would do this. And so he began to faithfully keep his diary with all honesty, putting down whatever he'd done, whatever he'd thought about, whatever he had said. And after a few days, he looked over what he had written so far, and he realized there was no way he was going to show that to his father. When he saw his private thoughts, words, and deeds laid bare that way, he realized that he really wasn't doing as well as he thought he was. And so he went to his father and he said, Dad, I can't do this. He said, so many things I wrote down I'm ashamed of. I thought I was a good person, that I was doing everything just fine, but when I'm frankly honest with myself, I couldn't show that to you or anyone else. And his father said, well, we all think we're good. But when we strip ourselves down and look at our ego, we realize that we're selfish. We do a lot of things that we wouldn't want others to know about. And that's why I go to the temple. Not to show religiousness or to listen to sermons, but to look into myself. He went on to say, we find it easy to blame and criticize, but when we look at ourselves closely, we're not angels. With introspection like that comes understanding. And when we can understand ourselves, we can forgive others and get the true inner peace that comes only from seeing ourselves clearly. So I'm going to leave you with a comment from a Korean Zen master, Sung San, who was talking about setting out on a path to authenticity and how to do it. And he said, you must first make a firm decision to attain enlightenment and help others. You already have the 5 precepts, the 5 moral rules. Know when to keep them and when to break them, when they are open, when they are closed. And then let go of your small self and become your true self. In original nature, there's no this and no that. The great round mirror has no likes nor dislikes. Thank you for your attention.